All right, we carry on. Now, we are looking at the archaeological finds that relate to Jesus' time on earth. When we ended, we were looking at Peter's house in Capernaum, and I want to pick back up there. I'm going to repeat a bit of what I said before just to bring us back. But as I said last week, in 1968, Virgilio Corbo and Stanislao Lafreda, they began investigating a 5th century octagonal church that's located just 84 feet south of the synagogue in Capernaum. And during the Byzantine era, which includes the 5th century, octagonal churches were often built over sacred sites in the Holy Land. So this is a 5th century octagonal church they begin investigating. And beneath that octagonal church, they found a 4th century church. And beneath that 4th century church, they found a 1st century house. And as I mentioned last week, the walls of that house were narrow. They would not have supported a masonry roof. And the walls, the ceilings, and the floor of the central room of that house were plastered in the 1st century. And that's something that was done for public rooms that were used for special purposes. And it's the only house in Capernaum to have plastered walls, the only house that's known. And the walls and the floors went on, they were replastered at least twice. Now, in the middle of the 1st century, there was a change in the pottery that is used in that central room, indicating that it changed from normal residential living. In other words, there's certain pottery that's common for normal living. But now you have a change in that, and you get things like more lamps and this kind of thing. And more than 150, I think it's 190, in fact, 197 maybe, inscriptions were scratched on those plaster walls. And they were in Greek, Syriac, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin, and they were scratched there beginning in the 2nd century, and maybe even before that. So these inscriptions on the plaster walls of this house, they begin in the 2nd century, possibly earlier. Most of the inscriptions are after 200, but they include appeals to Christ for help. They include possible, some would say certain, references to Peter. They include various Christian symbols like crosses. And sometime after the 1st century, the roof of that central room, it was raised, and the 5th century octagonal church, that chapel was centered on that central room of that house. So, right there in the center of it. So all of this suggests something. Now, this is the only house in this area of Galilee that has been identified by archaeologists, by pilgrims, and by ancient tradition as Peter's house. The archaeologist Titus Kennedy, he says the house has an extremely early tradition as being the house of Peter, documented in the 4th century AD during the pilgrimage of Agaria, who wrote that, quote, in Capernaum, what is more, the house of the Prince of the Apostles, that would be Peter, has been turned into a church. Now, he's writing in the 300s. The house has been turned into a church, leaving its original walls, however, quite unchanged. Now, here is how this looks today. That octagonal church structure I showed you was before it had been covered by this museum. And that's how it looks today. And here's a view from inside the museum looking down into the house. And you can see here, so now many scholars are persuaded, they accept that this evidence is in fact, establishes that this is Peter's house. For example, James Charlesworth, he says archaeological evidence is almost always hotly debated. That's because you can make arguments about things, and that's what scholarly types do. He says, what then is clear? The house church in Capernaum that is celebrated as Peter's house may well be the house in which Jesus taught. It is certainly not a synagogue, but it seems to be Peter's house. Thus, I fully agree with J. Murphy O'Connor, who's unusually well informed of data relating to Jesus and archaeology and astutely critical. Notice his judgment. The most reasonable assumption is the one attested by the Byzantine pilgrims, namely that it was the house of Peter in which Jesus may have lodged. Certainly, nothing in the excavations contradicts this identification. So this is what I think it is. I think, unless you've got a plaque there on the wall that says this is Peter's house, this is as close as you're going to get, because you have to infer these things from the data. And that says to me, from all of that, the history and everything else, that this is in fact Peter's house where so much went down. Now, John chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, that says that when Jesus was on his way to Galilee, he came to Jacob's well at Sychar in Samaria, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. So he comes here, he comes to Jacob's well that's at Sychar in Samaria, and that site is near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Genesis chapter 33, verses 18 and 19, Joshua 24:32, they locate that field that Joseph gave to Jacob at Shechem. And John chapter 4 verse 20 indicates that they were at the foot of Mount Gerizim. And you remember Mount Ebal and Gerizim, and Shechem is right in that little valley. So here's this field at Shechem, and where are they? They're right at the foot of Mount Gerizim, and so they're right in that area. Now there's no reference to a well being dug by or for Jacob in the Bible, but it's no doubt it's named Jacob's well because of its proximity to that field that was given to Jacob, that was given to him. That he had given to Joseph. So this is, of course, where Jesus conversed with the Samaritan woman. And we're familiar with that story. Well, a well that's at the base of Mount Gerizim, so right in the right place, less than a half mile southeast of ancient Shechem at Tel Balata, about a half mile south of the village that's known as Ascar, which is thought to be ancient Sychar. This site, this well, is accepted by Jews, Samaritans, Christians, and Muslims. Everybody accepts that this is in fact Jacob's well. So there's no disagreement among different groups that might have an incentive to disagree. And it's now located in a Greek Orthodox church, which has been under construction since the early 20th century. At least a few years ago, they were still working on it. But it's here located in this church, and this well is mentioned in AD 333 by the pilgrim of Bordeaux. It's mentioned some years after that, in the middle of the 4th century, by Eusebius. And Jerome indicates in AD 380 that a church had been built on that site. Now, as it happens, when you have these sites that are constructed and you have a long history, well, that church was destroyed in the 7th century. It was then replaced by another church in the 12th century. And then the Greek Orthodox Church, they bought the well and the surrounding property in 1885. And so this is where Jacob's well is, right where Jesus went. And I just think that's cool. Now, in 1881, a man named C.W. Barclay, he published the dimensions of the well. And so the opening of it was 17.5 inches. And then the shaft, when you get past the opening, the shaft of the well spreads out to 7 feet 6 inches. And it goes down 67 feet, at least in 1881 when Barclay did his measurements. Now, John chapter 5, verse 2, mentions a pool in Jerusalem that's located near the sheep gate, that in Aramaic, this pool is called Bethesda. So John says that. Now, John notes that it has 5 roofed colonnades. So the pool of Bethesda has 5 roofed colonnades, according to John. And it's the sheep gate. It's located near the sheep gate. You probably can't see this, but the sheep gate is known to be on the north side of here's the Temple Mount, and here's the sheep gate right there. And so the sheep gate's known to be on the north side of the Temple Mount. And then there was this copper scroll, the copper scroll that was discovered as part of the Qumran documents, and it's dated before AD 70. Okay, so before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. It refers to Beth Eshdathayan, and that means the house of the twin pools. So we have a very early, before AD 70, we of course have John, but we have well, John's probably written after that, but we have, before AD 70, we have this reference to the house of the twin pools in the copper scroll. Eusebius, the Christian historian, who writes the first history of the church, finishes the last edition around AD 325. Eusebius identifies the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem as having twin pools. So he's on board with that, as does the Pilgrim of Bordeaux. And Eusebius alludes to the proximity of those twin pools as being near the temple area. So this fits, you see, with when John says, it's just weird when John says it has 5 roofed colonnades. But then when you see, it's twin pools. Well, now it makes perfect sense because I have the 2 pools here, and I have 1 roof colonnade, 2, 3, 4, and then 1 that runs in the middle. So those are the 5 roof colonnades that he's talking about. Now, shortly after the turn of the 20th century, 2 large pools were found north of the north wall of the Temple Mount. Okay, so right in the right area, we find these 2 large pools. They'd been cut into rock and they had been plastered. And you can see here there are many fragments of column bases, capitals, drums that you have here. They were found, which in archaeologist John McRae's words, he says they probably belonged to the 5 porches, that is the porticos or colonnaded walkways of the pool John mentions. So here, right in this area, we have John discussing this item, and here we discover it archaeologically. John chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. There, Jesus heals the blind man, and you're very familiar with that story. He tells him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And the healed blind man, he also repeats the name of the pool in chapter 9, verse 11, when he's telling other people about his healing. So we have John referring here to the pool of Siloam. And then following excavations by 2 archaeologists, Frederick Bliss and Archibald Dickey, in the late 19th century, 1896, 98, right around there. I think they published it in 1898. It was thought that the pool of Siloam was the pool that had later come to be known as the pool of Silwan. It's the pool that is the outlet for the Siloam tunnel. You remember that Hezekiah builds from the Gihon spring, that tunnel that empties into the pool of Siloam? So the tunnel empties into what Blass and Dickey find here, this later known as the pool of Silwan. And here is what that pool looks like from the traditional site, what it looks like today. And when you hear pool, you shouldn't think of YMCA swimming pools. Okay, these pools can just be bodies of water that are used for a variety of purposes, so they can be different depending on why they're used. So here is what is the traditional site of the pool of Siloam. But in 2004, a large pool was discovered by archaeologist Eli Shukran on the south side of that traditional site of the pool of Siloam. And the pool that Shukran found is about 165 feet long. And it's lined with stone, and it has steps leading into it from all sides. And there's an elaborately paved assembly area that is next to that pool. And here's an image of what that looked like. This is some years ago. They've done some additional work there. But is that the pool of Siloam? After Shukran's discovery and the initial digging, that pretty much convinced people that yes, Blass and Dickey had missed it That wasn't the pool of Siloam. This is the actual pool of Siloam. But doubts have arisen about that identification. And when I taught this last time, I was pretty sure about that, but now it seems to me that maybe not. Maybe not. You see, most notably, Nishan Zanton from Tel Aviv University, he published an article in 2023 arguing that no, the original site, the Pool of Siloam, was the site found by Blass and Dickey, this one into which the Gihon Spring empties. You see, there. Now, you see here, the idea is, well, there's another little tunnel that carries on from there. But I don't know that that's certain. But in any event, Zanton's article, he makes the case that, look, that the real site is that original one, and the pool that Shukran found in 2004, that's what's known as Solomon's Pool. Okay, I'm not sure where the answer to that is, but in any event, John's information is corroborated, right? I mean, John is saying there's a pool of Siloam. He refers to it. Whether it's Blass and Dickey's site or whether it's Shukran's site, which are very close together, we still know there is, in fact, a pool of Siloam in Jerusalem at the time John's telling us. So what I tell you, all of these little details where there's so much chance that if somebody's just making stuff up or doing it from a time he didn't know something, so much chance to be wrong. And it just doesn't turn out that way. Now, all four of the Gospels record that Pontius, that's how I've always said it, but some people say Pontius, but Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea who handed Jesus over to be crucified. So all of the Gospels acknowledge that, report that, and his role in that event's also noted in several places in Acts, and it's noted in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 13. So Pilate is a big figure in Christian history, right? Very well known. In 1961, Antonia Frova, he discovered at the city of Caesarea Maritima an inscription in Latin that mentions Pontius Pilate. And Pilate's existence isn't in doubt for anybody who cares about literature, coins, any of that stuff. But I'm talking about archaeological finds. And here we have an inscription, right, that mentions Pilate. Now, the left-hand side of the inscription, as you can see, it was chipped away. And that was probably to make the stone fit better into some kind of secondary usage. Like if you're here and you need a stone, and I've got a nice stone here, I just got to mess with it a little bit. That's probably what happened here. And I'm going to take it and use it in some other way. But the restoration of the second and third lines is clear. It says, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And the entire inscription is thought to have read or possibly read, to the people of Caesarea, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has given the Tiberium, which is perhaps a temple dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius. Okay, so here we have Pilate who's saying, here, I'm giving you this Tiberium, probably this thing, or perhaps a temple dedicated to that Roman emperor. Now, though Hendon, you remember David Hendon, he's the guy who wrote the book on the biblical coins. David Hendon, he lists 6 types of coins that were minted by Pontius Pilate. But unfortunately for the class, there are many coins of Pilate, but the Roman governors of Judea, they didn't put their names on the coins. There's no question that these coins are from Pilate. But since their names aren't there, what they would put the emperor's name or somebody from the emperor's family, the people to whom they were beholden for their position. They didn't put their names on them, so I'm not going to give you the coins from Pilate, nor will I give you the coins from the Roman procurators Antonius Felix or Porcius Festus, which there are coins for them too. But since they don't put their names on it, I'm not going to show you those. Now, Annas is mentioned in Luke chapter 3, verse 2, John chapter 18, verse 13, verse 24, Acts chapter 4, verse 6. Annas was the high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. Now, he's still called the high priest even after the time of his officially serving in that capacity. So he's actually the high priest from 6 to 15. He's called the high priest after that, presumably in a way that's similar to our continuing to refer to presidents as president. Right? They still talk about President Bush and right. It's because having served, they continue with that title. But he actually serves from 6 to 15, and he no doubt continued to wield significant power and influence, as indicated by the fact his son-in-law, Caiaphas, he served as the high priest from AD 18 to 36. So Annas 6 to 15, Caiaphas 18 to 36 or 37, and 5 of Annas' sons served as high priests. So this guy had juice, right? That's pretty clear. Now in 1994, the archaeologists Lean and Kathleen Rittmeyer, they made a very strong case that the first century burial tombs just south of the Temple Mount, near the junction you see of the Hinnom and Kidron valleys, in this area that's popularly known as Akeldama, they made a case that these include the tomb of the high priest Annas. See, rather than being a poor person's burial ground, here this, what was known as Akeldama, is an area of elegant and elegantly decorated tombs. Now, there are no identifying inscriptions. Here is what they propose is the tomb of Annas. Now, this is all busted. You'll see in the reconstruction I'm going to give you. You see this, there was a whole building up here. And this, you see this little thing here? That little ripples, I'll show you in the reconstruction. But this is, you look at that and it doesn't look that great. But still, here's this tomb here that is there. They find there's no inscriptions there, but there are these lines of evidence that convince them and point to this being the tomb of Annas. And here's how the Rittmeyers summarize that. They say the tombs of Akeldama are too elaborate to have been anything but burial places for Jerusalem's prominent citizens. Not just anybody gets a tomb like this. You can't afford a tomb like this. You're just living, right? So this says, okay, so we have prominent citizens here. It says their decoration of these tombs echoes that of the Temple Mount, where the priests served. So I see the decoration that seem to go and have these connection to the Temple Mount. And then it says, and Josephus places the tomb of Annas in the area of Akeldama. So I have all of these things going, leading them to believe that this particular tomb is in fact the tomb of Annas. And here is their reconstruction of it. And see, all you saw when I was pointing that little ridged thing, see, you just get to see a part of this little ridge right there. And everything else is, just taken down. So they say this is what it would have looked like based on what they can find down here. So, is that definitive? No, but it, really, I think maybe, I think there's a good case to be made for that. Now, Caiaphas, as I mentioned, he serves as the high priest. He's Annas' son-in-law. And he serves as the high priest from 18 to 36 or 37. So that's right when Jesus' ministry and his crucifixion, resurrection, right? This is around 30. Jesus is there ministering from, say, 27 to 30. So he's the high priest at that time, and he was involved in the plot to arrest and kill Jesus. You see that in Matthew 26, verses 3 and 4. You can also look in John 11:49. And Jesus was brought to Caiaphas to stand trial. You see in Matthew 26:57, also in John chapter 18. Now in 1990, see all of this fairly recent, right? Although 1990 is quickly disappearing in the rearview mirror. But in 1990, this ornate ossuary. Now an ossuary, I've said this before, but it's a bone box. And the way for a very short period of time that they buried people, the culture, how do we do burials in Judah for this period of time was you would put the body somewhere on a shelf. You would wait until the meat the flesh all rotted off, and then say a year later you would come back and collect the bones, and you would put the bones in a box, and the box is called an ossuary. So that's what this is. It's a bone box. And so in 1990, this bone box was discovered in the Peace Forest, which is south of the Temple Mount, by workers as they're building a water park. So they're, you're digging all this stuff, and you say, whoa, what do you know? And so here they find this very ornate ossuary, and it dates to the 1st century. So people who play in this world, who know how to gauge these things, this is not disputed that this ossuary, plus you have a very limited time when these things were used, a narrow window. And so this dates to the 1st century, and it has 2 inscriptions. One inscription is in Aramaic and one is in Hebrew. And those inscriptions may be translated, the first Caiaphas, and then the other Joseph, son of Caiaphas. So you get your head spinning. Caiaphas, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. What's that about? Well, fortunately, the Jewish historian Josephus, he's a 1st century Jewish historian, he says that Caiaphas's full name is Joseph, who is called Caiaphas of the high priesthood. And so here we have this ossuary that has on here Caiaphas, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And Josephus lets us know that, hey, Joseph, who is called Caiaphas of the high priesthood. And inside this bone box were the bones of 6 people, including the bones of an approximately 60-year-old man, which would have been about Caiaphas's age when he died. And so this is really intriguing. And many scholars are just completely convinced that this is the ossuary of Caiaphas. Those are Caiaphas's bones. And here's Jonathan Reed and John Dominic Crossan, who certainly are not evangelicals. Okay? You wouldn't put them in that camp. But here is their comment on it. They say there should be no doubt that the chamber was the resting place of the family of the high priest Caiaphas, named in the Gospels for his role in the crucifixion, and it's very likely that the elderly man's bones were those of Caiaphas himself. Okay, so that's not making this up, preacher talk. This is from the evidence from people who aren't disposed to see the Bible the way I do. They make this good confession. Now, does that mean that everybody agrees? Well, that's almost never true. Okay, others say, well, is the inscription, is that the correct translation of the inscription? Does it say Caiaphas? Okay, so there's some debate about that. But you have this I think, just an amazing find. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 21, it reveals that Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Okay, Mark 15:21. Now, that he's compelled to carry Jesus' cross. Simon of Cyrene. Mark probably mentions Alexander and Rufus because they were known to his audience. So he says, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, just to let you know who I'm talking about. Right? You guys know Alexander and Rufus. Well, this was their father. And he's compelled to carry the cross. Now, in 1941, Eliezer Sukenik and Naaman Avigad, they found a 1st century ossuary in the Kidron Valley. Okay, runs right along, the Kidron Valley and the Hinnom Valleys, and then there's the city of David there. Okay, so they find in the Kidron Valley, and its lid had the name Alexander. And that name was inscribed in Greek, and it had Alexander inscribed in Hebrew, but the Hebrew inscription, the name, that was followed by a word that is thought to be an adjective form of Cyrene, okay, the place. So we would translate it like Alexander the Cyrenite. So that's what that's thought of now. So it's thought to be that form. Now, Alexander, son of Simon, that was also written in Greek in a green chalky substance on the front, and it was scratched on the back. And then there's another ossuary, another bone box in the tomb that was inscribed Sarah, daughter of Simon of Ptolemais, probably referring to Ptolemais in Cyrene or Cyrenaica. Okay, so we have this. Here's what Jack Finnegan, in his book on archaeology in the New Testament, he says, "Thus we have here a family burial, at least to the extent of 2 children of a certain Simon, and their place of origin was probably Cyrene." Now from Acts chapter 6 verse 9, we know that there was a synagogue of Cyrenians in Jerusalem. And in Mark 15:21, it was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was compelled to carry the cross of Jesus. It is surely a real possibility that this unostentatious tomb was the last resting place of the bones of at least 2 members of the family of this very Simon. Okay, so again, these little throwaway details. Simon of Cyrene. Well, what do you know? Here's an ossuary of Simon's kids there. Now, Matthew, Mark, and John, they all record that Jesus was crucified at a place known in Aramaic as Golgotha. They all record that, and that means place of the skull. That's what Golgotha means. You see that in Matthew 27:33, Mark 15:22, John 19:17. Luke simply states that he was crucified at the place called the skull. Luke says that in Luke 23:33. John 19:41 says that there was a garden at the place where Jesus was crucified, and that in the garden was a new tomb. And John 19:42 says the tomb was near where Jesus was crucified. So the site of crucifixion and the burial place are close together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say the tomb was cut out of rock. Matthew and Mark specify that the entrance to the tomb was covered by a rolling rock. You see in Matthew 27:59-60, Mark 15:46, Luke 23:53, John 19:40-42. Hebrews chapter 13:12 says, and John 19:17, 19:41, they all imply that this site was outside the walls of Jerusalem. Okay, I give you all of that because those are data points. If we're going to figure out where is the tomb and where is the crucifixion site, those are data points. So any site we have has to satisfy those. All right, so that's what we have from Scripture. Now there is broad ancient and modern agreement that the tomb of Christ is located at the site that is known as in Jerusalem, that is known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, the so-called Garden Tomb that was championed by Charles Gordon in the 19th century, that site has had its advocates, but archaeology has pretty much torpedoed that. So there's just broad agreement that this is in fact the site of the tomb. Now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it is outside of the city walls as they existed in the first century. So that's the key, as they existed at the time of Christ. And this church is built over rock tombs that date to the first century. So all of that is important and fits. Now, you know the Jewish revolt, right? So from 66, you have the Jewish revolt, and in 70, the Romans destroy Jerusalem. And then you have the fall of Masada in 73, the last holdout. Now, so we're familiar with that, but many people aren't aware that some 60 years later, 70 years later, in the early 130s, there's another Jewish revolt. And this revolt is led by a man named Simon Bar Kokhba. And by this time, the Romans have had it. Okay, so Emperor Hadrian, he crushed that Jewish revolt in AD 135. He banned the Jews from Jerusalem, and he renamed the city of Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and he was determined to turn it into a pagan city. Jews out, I'm changing the name, and we're going to turn this place into a pagan city. And that included, one of the things of doing that included erecting a temple of Jupiter, a Roman god, and a shrine of Venus or Aphrodite at the site that would later become the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So Eusebius, the Christian historian, who's writing roughly 2 centuries later after Hadrian, he writes and he implies that at that time he was writing, in the early 4th century here, that Golgotha was inaccessible. And it was inaccessible because of the structures that Hadrian had built. So he builds these temples to Greek or to Roman gods. And Eusebius says Golgotha is inaccessible at that time. And we know from Eusebius, Eusebius is a contemporary of these early 4th century events I'm going to talk about. So he's right there on site, intimately familiar with Constantine. He says that after the Council of Nicaea, which is in 325, right? Constantine converts. So after the Council of Nicaea in 325, Constantine decided to construct a church on the site of Jesus' resurrection. So he's going to build a church where Jesus rose. And the fact that Constantine ordered those pagan temples that Hadrian had built to be torn down and that a church be erected in its place, right? That tells you that the Christians, at least in the 4th century, they were confident that Christ's tomb would be found under those pagan temples that Hadrian had erected in his determination to turn Jerusalem into a pagan city. And Eusebius reports with joyfully that the excavations at that time revealed the Holy Tomb. So this is in the early 4th century that he's saying it. Now in 1009, Constantine's church was destroyed by the Egyptian Caliph Hakim. In 1048, a new church was built over the tomb. There were further destructions, there were repairs, there was construction. And in 1959, this Church of the Holy Sepulchre underwent a major repair program. But so here we have, you see the tomb, here you see Calvary. Now here is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They have a separate little structure called an edicule that is around the very site of the tomb. And there you see that. And here is a picture of the entrance into that little edicule as you would go into. And then here is a picture of some other 1st century tombs that are at the west end of the church. And see, so they look quite different than when you look at how the church has been constructed and done that way. So you have that. Now I want to move, and so that's what I wanted to share with you about archaeological finds that I think are significant from Jesus' time on earth. Now I want to move into the time of the early church, which I'm going to take from AD 30 to 100. And I hope I'm going to be able to finish this by next week, but we'll see. All right, we see in Acts chapter 9, verse 23 to 25, that after many days of being unable to counter Paul's arguments that Jesus was the Christ, well, the Jewish leaders in Damascus, they plotted to kill him. Right? You know this. And so Paul learns of their plan, and though they were watching him at the city gates 24/7, he escaped their plot by being lowered in a basket at night through an opening in the city wall. Right? Now, this is in the mid-30s AD. Paul, decades later, when he writes 1 Corinthians, he refers to this event, and he says, in Damascus, the ethnarch of King Aretas was guarding the city of the Damascenes in order to seize me. And I was lowered in a basket through a window through the wall and escaped from his hands. So here he refers to the guy who's guarding me is the ethnarch. He's the agent of King Aretas to keep me in that city, and I managed to escape. Well, a burial inscription of a Nabatean governor named Itabel, which is dated to AD 37, was found in Madaba, Jordan, just south of Damascus, and it mentions King Aretas IV. So again, one of these little details. You're right, and you say, Yeah, we don't care anything. We just make stuff up. Well, man, you got the king's name right. See, I'm here. I'm being held at the instruction of the King Aretas. Well, yeah, there he is, King Aretas. Now, Herod Agrippa, he was the grandson of Herod the Great. Remember we talked before about Herod's sons, Archelaus, Antipas, Philip II? Well, Herod Agrippa, he's the grandson. All right, now he was educated in Rome, and he becomes friends with Gaius, who's better known as Caligula. He becomes friends with both Gaius and Claudius, both of whom become Roman emperors. All right, so here we have Agrippa's friends with them. Paul Barnett, he says, Caligula appointed Agrippa king of Gaulonitis in 37 and of Galilee in 39. At the time of Caligula's assassination, it's tough being a Roman emperor, by the way. It's a jungle out there. At the time of Caligula's assassination, Agrippa, who was then in Rome, persuaded Claudius to accept the imperial purple. So persuades him, go ahead and take on the role of emperor. Upon his accession in 41, Claudius added Judea to Agrippa's kingdom. So he now is king over that. And there was tension between Rome and Israel. It was quite high at that time. And Claudius, he may have thought that his buddy, his friend, would be a good person in this volatile time to be king over those people. So he's basically going to be his guy to help pacify him and keep him in line, right? So Agrippa rules only 3 years in Judea because he dies in 44. And so he dies then. Now this is the Herod. It's Herod Agrippa who is mentioned in Acts chapter 12. He killed James, the brother of John, and imprisoned Peter. So that's who we're talking about here with Herod Agrippa. He was struck by an angel of the Lord and he subsequently died. And David Hendon lists 15 types of coins that Herod Agrippa had minted. And Agrippa is identified by name on 4 of those coins, and here is one of them. So again, we know Agrippa from literary sources and these things, but these are archaeological, tangible things that we can go and grab and see here is King Agrippa. Okay? Real people, real stuff happening and going on. I'm looking. I got 23 seconds. I'm not going to do it. Just be frustrating. Okay. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to try to finish. All right. Thanks for coming. So, we're going to end next week. That's the plan. This week and next week will end. Always wonder about the timing of these things, so we'll just see. I think that's it. I'm going to have to end because I wouldn't have enough for another class after that. So I may race next week, may slow next week, I don't know. But the plan is to end next week, and then the week after that, Lord willing, we'll start 2 Corinthians.